My name is Carmen, and at 64, I've spent my life caring for others as a nurse in Portland, Oregon. When my son Michael lost his job 9 years ago, my husband Frank and I welcomed him and his wife Denise into our home. We thought it would be temporary while they saved for their own place. Everything changed when baby James was born 3 months ago. We were overjoyed to be grandparents, but yesterday, when my arthritic husband tried to comfort our crying grandson, my daughter-in-law violently shoved him and screamed words, "I'll never forget. Don't touch him. You're filthy." My blood ran cold. Before you hear about the 3 words that changed everything, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and hit subscribe to join me on this journey of standing up for family dignity. I've always believed that a family's strength comes from supporting each other through difficult times. That belief shaped my entire life, from my career choice to how Frank and I raised our children. Looking back now, I wonder if perhaps our generosity became a weakness that others learned to exploit. Frank and I met during our sophomore year at Oregon State University. I was studying nursing while he was pursuing education with dreams of becoming a science teacher. We were paired as lab partners in a biology course, and his gentle patience with complex concepts complemented my practical, hands-on approach. By graduation, we were engaged, and we married shortly after in a simple ceremony surrounded by family and friends. We started our careers with optimism and purpose, Frank teaching high school science and me working at Portland General Hospital. We lived frugally in a small apartment, saving diligently for a house where we could raise a family. After 5 years of marriage, we put a down payment on a spacious 4-bedroom home in a quiet suburb with excellent schools. It stretched our budget, but we believed in investing in our future family's well-being. Michael was born 2 years later, a sensitive boy with Frank's thoughtful nature and curious mind. His sister Emma followed just 2 years after that, bringing a determined spirit and practical outlook that reminded everyone of me. Our home became exactly what we'd hoped, filled with science projects on the kitchen table, story time in the living room, and family dinners where we discussed our days. Those early years weren't without challenges. We juggled demanding careers with parenting, sometimes working opposite shifts to avoid childcare costs. Frank would grade papers late into the night after the children were asleep. I picked up extra weekend shifts to contribute to college funds. We never had luxury vacations or the newest cars, but our children never lacked what mattered: stability, education, and unconditional love. Michael was always the more sensitive of our children. In elementary school, he struggled when classmates teased him about his interest in art and music rather than sports. Frank spent countless hours helping him build confidence, encouraging his creativity, while also teaching him to stand firm in his own interests. By high school, Michael had found his place among the theater and band students, though he remained somewhat susceptible to peer influence. Emma, in contrast, knew her mind from the moment she could speak. She excelled in mathematics and debate, rarely concerned with others' opinions of her choices. While Michael might change his position to please those around him, Emma defended her views with well-constructed arguments that left little room for challenge. Both children attended state universities with partial scholarships supplemented by their own part-time jobs and our careful savings. We were immensely proud when they graduated, Michael with a degree in graphic design and Emma in business administration. Frank and I felt we'd accomplished our primary goal as parents, launching 2 independent, educated adults into the world. Michael met Denise during his junior year of college. She was studying marketing with ambitious plans for a corporate career. When Michael first brought her home, I was impressed by her confidence and the way she engaged Frank in conversations about education policy. She seemed genuinely interested in our lives, asking thoughtful questions about my nursing experiences and admiring our modest home with apparent sincerity. Their courtship was brief, barely a year before Michael announced their engagement. Frank and I were surprised by the speed but supportive of their happiness. The wedding planning revealed the first glimpses of Denise's controlling nature. She had strong opinions about every detail and expected immediate accommodation of her preferences. When I gently suggested blue flowers might complement the bridesmaids' dresses better than her chosen pink, her smile remained fixed while her eyes flashed with momentary anger. "I've always dreamed of pink peonies, Carmen," she said, using my first name despite my subtle hints that I'd prefer Mom or even Mrs. Sullivan until our relationship developed naturally. "I'm sure you understand how important it is for a bride to have exactly what she's always wanted." Frank squeezed my hand under the table, our long-established signal to let something go. "Of course, dear," I replied. "Pink peonies will be lovely." The wedding was elegant beyond what Frank and I could comfortably afford, though we contributed the traditional parents of the groom portion without complaint. Denise's parents, both successful attorneys, covered the majority of costs, but made numerous comments about our charming contribution in tones that felt more condescending than appreciative. For the first year of their marriage, Michael and Denise seemed happy in their apartment near her marketing firm. They visited for Sunday dinners regularly, and while Denise's comments occasionally carried subtle criticisms about the outdated style of our kitchen or the practicality of Frank's book collection, the relationship remained cordial. Everything changed when Michael's design agency downsized, suddenly eliminating his position along with several others. At 32 years old, our son found himself unemployed for the first time in his adult life. During a tearful phone call, he explained that their apartment lease was ending the following month, and they couldn't afford to renew without his income. "We'll figure something out," I assured him, already knowing what Frank and I would offer. That weekend, over pot roast and mashed potatoes, Frank and I proposed what we thought would be a temporary solution. Michael and Denise could move into our home while he job hunted and rebuilt their savings. We had plenty of space since Emma had moved out years earlier, and our mortgage was nearly paid off. "Just until you get back on your feet," Frank said warmly. "No rush." Denise's reaction surprised me. Not gratitude, but a calculating look that passed quickly before she smiled. "That's incredibly generous," she said. "We accept, don't we, Michael?" Michael looked relieved. "Are you sure it won't be an imposition? We don't want to disrupt your lives." "Nonsense," I insisted. "Family helps family. That's what we're here for." Within 2 weeks, Michael and Denise had moved into our upstairs bedrooms. Not just the master bedroom that had been Michael's childhood room, but also converting Frank's small home office into what Denise called her remote workspace. Frank relocated his desk to the corner of our bedroom without complaint, though I noticed him gazing longingly at his old setup when he thought no one was watching. We established no formal agreements about rent or household contributions. In our minds, this arrangement would last a few months, while Michael secured new employment. When he found a position 3 months later at a smaller design firm, with a significantly lower salary than his previous job, Denise explained that it made financial sense to continue living with us while they saved for a down payment on a house. "Property in good neighborhoods is so expensive," she said over dinner one evening, about 6 months into their stay. "It would be foolish to rush into something we can't afford when we have such a comfortable situation here, wouldn't it?" Frank nodded agreeably. "Take your time. We enjoy having you both here." I wasn't quite as convinced, but smiled and changed the subject. In truth, I was already noticing concerning patterns. Denise rarely contributed to household chores, leaving dishes in the sink and clothes in the washer for me to handle. She redecorated the guest bathroom without asking, removing the seashell-themed items I'd carefully collected and replacing them with modern geometric prints that meant nothing to me. More troubling was the gradual change in Michael. My once thoughtful son began deferring to Denise in all matters large and small. He checked with her before accepting invitations to family events. He abandoned his vegetable garden in our backyard after she commented that it took too much of his time. When I asked if he'd like his favorite lemon cake for his birthday, he glanced at Denise before declining, explaining that they were watching their sugar intake. By the 3rd year of this temporary arrangement, what had started as minor irritations had evolved into a household divided. Denise and Michael occupied the upstairs almost exclusively, coming down primarily for meals that I prepared. Frank and I found ourselves whispering in our own kitchen, conscious of not disturbing their routine or triggering Denise's increasingly frequent complaints about noise. Frank's retirement after 38 years of teaching coincided with the 5-year anniversary of Michael and Denise living with us. We'd hoped his retirement might rebalance the household dynamics, allowing him more enjoyment of the home we'd worked so hard to create. Instead, his increased presence seemed to irritate Denise, who had grown accustomed to having the house to herself during workdays, as she'd transitioned to remote work for her marketing firm. "Does he have to watch television at that volume?" she asked Michael one evening, loud enough for Frank to hear from his recliner. "Some of us are trying to work." Frank immediately lowered the volume, though I could see from across the room that he was already struggling to hear the documentary he'd been looking forward to all week. Later that night, he ordered wireless headphones online without mentioning it to me, but I saw the confirmation email when I used his laptop to check our banking. My retirement 3 years ago should have been a joyful transition after 4 decades of nursing. I'd imagined gardening during spring mornings, afternoon book clubs, and occasional road trips with Frank to national parks we'd always wanted to visit. Instead, I found myself increasingly serving as an unpaid housekeeper and cook for my son and daughter-in-law, while watching my husband become a virtual stranger in his own home. Through all this, our daughter Emma watched with growing concern during her visits. Living an hour away with her husband Paul and their 2 children, she had maintained her independence while building a successful career in financial planning. Her relationship with Michael had always been loving but competitive, and Denise's obvious favoritism toward Emma's children versus more distant cousin relationships only complicated family gatherings. "Mom, this isn't right," Emma said during one of our private lunch dates about 7 years into Michael and Denise's stay. "They're taking advantage of you and Dad. Have you actually talked about when they plan to move out?" "We've mentioned it a few times," I admitted. "But Denise always has a reason why the timing isn't right. Housing market conditions, saving for a bigger down payment, Michael's job security." "And you believe those excuses?" Emma's directness, normally a quality I admired, stung in this context. "What would you have us do? Tell our own son he's not welcome in our home?" My voice cracked slightly. "Your father and I just want to help." Emma reached across the table to squeeze my hand. "Helping is one thing, Mom. Being exploited is another. There's a difference between supporting someone and enabling them to take advantage of your generosity." I changed the subject, then unwilling to admit even to myself how accurately Emma had assessed our situation. But her words stayed with me, surfacing in quiet moments when I noticed Frank wincing as he climbed the stairs with his arthritic knees, careful to avoid creaking the floorboards near Denise's office, or when I found myself apologizing for running the dishwasher during Denise's conference call. What had our home become, and more importantly, what had we allowed it to become? These questions haunted me as year 8 of our temporary arrangement stretched into year 9 with no end in sight. When Denise announced her pregnancy at Sunday dinner last year, the news produced a complex mixture of emotions I wasn't entirely proud of. Genuine joy at becoming a grandmother mingled with a weary realization that this development would further entrench Michael and Denise in our home. Frank, ever the optimist, saw only the blessing of a new family member. "A baby!" he exclaimed, his eyes lighting up in a way I hadn't seen in years. "This calls for a toast." He raised his water glass, his arthritic fingers curled carefully around the base. "To new life and new adventures." I watched Denise closely during this moment of celebration. While she accepted congratulations with practiced grace, I caught the calculating glance she directed toward our underutilized formal dining room, a space we'd preserved for holiday gatherings but rarely used otherwise. Within days, she approached me with what she presented as a practical suggestion. "Carmen, we've been thinking about the baby's nursery." She began, using the reasonable tone she adopted when preparing to claim more territory. The guest room is really too small, and since no one ever stays overnight anyway. She paused, waiting for me to fill in the obvious conclusion. You're thinking of the dining room, I asked, although I already knew the answer. It would be perfect ground floor, good natural light, and close to the kitchen for those middle-of-the-night bottles. Her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. We just need to move that old china cabinet to make space for the crib. The old china cabinet held my grandmother's wedding china and crystal that had been passed down through generations. I had served holiday meals to Michael throughout his childhood, using those dishes creating memories I had hoped to continue with my grandchildren. I'll discuss it with Frank, I said neutrally, unwilling to agree on the spot. Denise's smile tightened slightly. Great. Let me know by tomorrow so we can start measuring for furniture. That evening, I found Frank in the garden tending to his tomato plants, despite the discomfort I knew it caused his hands. Denise wants to convert the dining room into a nursery, I said without preamble. Frank straightened slowly, wiping soil from his fingers onto his worn jeans. I thought they might. He sighed, looking toward the house. Where would we put your grandmother's things? She didn't address that part of the equation. Frank was quiet for a moment, his expression thoughtful. A baby needs space, Carmen, and it is our grandchild. I know that, I said, trying to keep frustration from my voice. But at what point do we stop rearranging our lives to accommodate their expanding presence? They've been here 9 years, Frank. 9 years without contributing financially or even discussing a timeline for moving out. Maybe after the baby comes. After the baby comes, they'll have even more reasons to stay, I interrupted. School district's stability, built-in childcare. Us. Frank's shoulders slumped slightly. What do you want to do? The question was simple, but the answer wasn't. I wanted my home back. I wanted peaceful evenings with my husband without walking on eggshells. I wanted to enjoy becoming a grandmother without being treated like unpaid household staff. But I also wanted to support my son and welcome my grandchild. Let's offer the dining room, I finally said. But this time, we need to have a real conversation about their future plans. That conversation never materialized. Any attempt to discuss long-term arrangements was deflected by Denise with comments about focusing on the healthy development of your grandchild or not adding stress during pregnancy. Michael avoided the topic entirely, working longer hours at the design firm and citing exhaustion when he was home. As Denise's pregnancy progressed, so did her expectations of my involvement. Despite having refused my company at doctor appointments, she demanded specific meals to satisfy her cravings, regardless of the time or inconvenience. When Frank's arthritis flared badly during month 5 of her pregnancy, causing him to drop a mug that shattered on the kitchen floor, Denise's reaction was disproportionate. I can't believe you'd be so careless, she snapped, standing in the doorway in her bathrobe. There could be microscopic ceramic particles in the air now. Do you know what that could do to a developing baby? Frank, already on his knees attempting to clean up despite his painful joints, looked stricken. I'm so sorry, I didn't mean. Frank has arthritis, Denise, I interrupted, moving to help my husband. It was an accident. Well, maybe he shouldn't be handling breakable items then, she retorted before turning to leave. Make sure you disinfect the entire area, twice. These incidents multiplied as her pregnancy advanced. Frank's occasional cough from seasonal allergies became potentially harmful to the baby's developing immune system. The gentle classical music he played while reading, a lifelong habit, was suddenly too stimulating for prenatal development. The natural cleaning products I'd used for years were deemed insufficiently antibacterial and replaced with harsh chemicals that irritated Frank's respiratory system. Through it all, Michael remained largely absent or silent. When present, he absorbed Denise's perspective, completely approaching his father one evening to ask if Frank could try to cough less forcefully, or perhaps wear a mask when your allergies are bad. I watched my husband retreat further into himself, spending more time in our bedroom or the garden shed he'd converted into a small sanctuary. His health began to suffer. Not just the arthritis, which worsened under stress, but also his blood pressure and sleep quality. The vibrant, engaged educator who had inspired generations of students became increasingly withdrawn. His natural enthusiasm dimmed. My concerns grew when I accidentally discovered a stack of rental applications in Michael and Denise's bathroom drawer while searching for a spare tube of toothpaste. Each application was blank despite Denise's regular claims of submitting paperwork to several properties and waiting to hear back from landlords. That discovery prompted me to do something I had never imagined necessary. I reviewed our son's financial situation. Using the banking app left open on their shared tablet, I confirmed what I had begun to suspect. Michael's salary, combined with Denise's remote marketing income, would easily support a comfortable apartment or even a modest house payment. They had substantial savings that had grown steadily during 9 years of living with minimal expenses in our home. They weren't staying out of financial necessity. They were staying because it was convenient and financially advantageous. My distress over this realization was compounded when I noticed something else changing in our home. Family photographs being relocated to less prominent positions, then disappearing altogether, replaced by modern art prints Denise preferred. One evening, I found a box in the garage containing these family mementos. Photos of Michael's childhood, Frank's teaching awards, vacation snapshots of our family through the years. When I confronted Michael, his response cut deeply. Denise thought it might be nice to create a more contemporary atmosphere before the baby comes, he explained awkwardly. Less cluttered, you know. Our family history had become clutter to be packed away and forgotten. As I returned the box to our bedroom closet, I caught sight of my reflection in the mirror. A woman I barely recognized, her expression a mixture of sadness and something else. Something that looked surprisingly like anger. My daughter Emma noticed the changes during her monthly visit, commenting on both the physical alterations to our home and the emotional atmosphere. "Mom, you look exhausted," she said directly. "And Dad seems almost afraid to speak in his own house. This isn't healthy for either of you." "It's temporary," I replied automatically, the phrase I'd been repeating for 9 years now, feeling hollow even to my own ears. Emma's expression made it clear she wasn't accepting this response anymore. "The baby will be here in less than 2 months. Have you thought about what that will mean for your daily lives, for your relationship with Dad, for your health?" I hadn't allowed myself to fully consider these questions, focusing instead on practical preparations. Assembling the crib that now occupied our former dining room, washing tiny clothes, reorganizing kitchen cabinets to make room for bottles and formula. "We'll adjust," I said weakly. "That's what families do." Emma took my hands in hers, her grip firm and grounding. "Mom, there's a difference between supporting family and allowing yourself to be erased from your own life. You taught me that strength sometimes means setting boundaries. Maybe it's time you remembered that lesson yourself." Her words stayed with me as Denise's due date approached. I found myself observing Frank more closely, noticing how he carefully planned his movements through the house to minimize interactions with Denise, how he spoke less frequently and more softly, how the spark in his eyes had dimmed to a cautious wariness. We were becoming ghosts in our own home, and the imminent arrival of our first grandchild, an event that should have brought unmitigated joy, instead carried an undercurrent of apprehension about what new demands and restrictions would follow. James Andrew Sullivan was born on a Tuesday morning in early spring, a healthy 7-pound boy with a full head of dark hair like his father's. We received no call when Denise went into labor, learning of his birth only when Michael texted a brief announcement and photos several hours after delivery. "A grandson," Frank said softly, studying the phone screen with wonder. "He looks just like Michael did." "Should we go to the hospital?" I asked, already reaching for my purse. The response to my text asking this question came an hour later. "Maybe tomorrow. Denise is resting now and doesn't want too many visitors." We later discovered that Denise's parents had been present for the birth and were already at the hospital holding their grandson while we waited for permission to visit. This pattern, being informed after decisions were made, included as an afterthought, continued when they brought James home 3 days later. "We'll handle night feedings ourselves," Denise announced when I offered to help. "We've worked out a system." That system apparently broke down by the third night when I woke at 2 a.m. to the sound of James crying. After 30 minutes of continuous wailing, I ventured upstairs to find Michael pacing the hallway with a screaming infant while Denise sobbed in their bedroom. "He won't stop," Michael said, desperately, dark circles already forming under his eyes. "We've tried everything." Decades of nursing experience and 2 children of my own had taught me several techniques for soothing distressed babies. I gently took James from Michael's arms, checked his diaper, and then held him against my shoulder in a specific position that often helped colicky infants. Within minutes, his cries subsided into hiccuping breaths, then peaceful sleep. "How did you do that?" Michael whispered, amazement and exhaustion mingling in his expression. "Experience," I said simply. "Go get some sleep. I'll sit with him for a while." This moment of competence established a contradictory pattern in the following weeks. Denise simultaneously relied on and resented my expertise with the baby. She would accept help during moments of overwhelming exhaustion, but then reassert control with rigid rules about how James should be held fed or dressed. Frank was largely excluded from these interactions, permitted only brief supervised visits with his grandson. "I don't think Denise wants me near the baby," Frank confided one evening as we prepared for bed. "She takes James to another room whenever I enter." "That's ridiculous," I said, though I had noticed the same behavior. "You're his grandfather." "She's worried about my medications," he continued, referring to the prescriptions he took for arthritis and blood pressure. "I heard her tell Michael they could be transmitted through skin contact." "That's medically inaccurate," I replied, my nursing knowledge immediately recognizing the absurdity. "Your medications aren't secreted through your skin in any meaningful amount, and even if traces were present, brief contact wouldn't affect James." Frank shrugged, the gesture carrying a resignation that broke my heart. "It doesn't matter what's medically accurate. It matters what Denise believes." I spent that night researching medical literature, printing peer-reviewed studies confirming that Frank's medications posed absolutely no risk to an infant through casual contact. The next morning, I presented these materials to Denise at breakfast, attempting a diplomatic approach. "I thought you might find this reassuring," I said, sliding the folder across the table. "The research shows Frank's medications aren't transmitted through skin contact, so there's no need to worry about him holding James." Denise barely glanced at the papers. "Internet research isn't the same as a medical degree, Carmen. We're just being cautious with our son's health. I was a registered nurse for 40 years. I reminded her, struggling to keep my tone even. "This isn't internet speculation. These are peer-reviewed medical journals." "Every patient is different," she countered dismissively. "We'll discuss it with James's pediatrician at his next appointment." That discussion never occurred, or if it did, we weren't informed of the outcome. The restrictions around Frank continued, eventually expanding to include concerns about his arthritis making his grip unreliable for holding an infant, and his reading glasses potentially having sharp edges dangerous to a baby. As James approached 3 months of age, a disturbing reality had solidified in our household. Denise controlled all access to our grandson, using him as leverage to further dominate household dynamics. Frank spent increasing amounts of time in his garden shed. His shoulders stooped, not just from arthritis, but from the weight of rejection. I functioned as on-demand childcare when Denise needed a break, but was criticized for any deviation from her exacting standards. Michael, when home, seemed perpetually exhausted and conflicted. I occasionally caught him watching his father with an expression that hinted at awareness of the injustice, but these moments of clarity never translated into action. His default position remained automatic agreement with Denise, regardless of the impact on his parents. The imbalance extended beyond emotional dynamics to practical household management. Denise left bottles, burp cloths, and soiled baby clothes scattered throughout common areas, expecting me to clean up without acknowledging the work. She criticized my cooking while relying on it for most meals. She monopolized the washing machine with daily loads of baby laundry using a special detergent that irritated Frank's skin, necessitating that we wash our clothes separately during late-night hours. My friends noticed my gradual withdrawal from social activities. My book club eventually stopped calling after I missed the third consecutive meeting to cover childcare while Denise napped. Frank and I hadn't attended church in weeks because Sunday mornings had become dedicated to whatever Denise deemed necessary for James's schedule. We were disappearing from our own lives, becoming extensions of Denise's needs, rather than individuals with our own identities and relationships. The home we had built as a sanctuary had transformed into a carefully monitored environment where we held increasingly subordinate positions. Something had to change, but I couldn't yet see the path forward. Then came the morning that crystallized everything, transforming simmering concerns into absolute clarity about what needed to happen next. The day began like many others in our new reality, earlier than I preferred after a night interrupted by James's cries. Frank and I were in the kitchen by 6:30, quietly preparing breakfast and coffee, careful not to make noise that might disturb Denise if she had finally fallen back asleep after the baby's 5 a.m. feeding. Frank sat at the kitchen table with his coffee and newspaper, his reading glasses perched on his nose as he skimmed the headlines. I was mixing batter for whole-grain pancakes. Denise had been requesting them frequently since breastfeeding increased her appetite. When we both heard it, the distinctive, desperate cry of an infant in distress. This wasn't James's normal hunger cry or the fussy sounds he made when needing a diaper change. This was a sustained, panicked wail that triggered immediate concern in both of us. Frank looked up from his paper, our eyes meeting in shared alarm. "Something's wrong," I said, setting down the mixing bowl and wiping my hands on a kitchen towel. We listened more carefully, trying to determine if Michael or Denise was responding to the baby. Instead of soothing voices or movement from their bedroom, we heard the shower running and music playing, suggesting Denise was bathing with her typical morning routine unchanged, despite James's obvious distress. "I'll check on him," Frank said, rising from his chair with the careful movements his arthritis demanded. "I'll be right behind you," I replied, turning off the stove burner. "Let me just make sure nothing will burn." Frank headed upstairs while I quickly secured the kitchen. By the time I reached the second floor, I could hear Frank's gentle voice coming from the nursery that had been created in what was once Michael's childhood bedroom. "There now, little one," he was saying softly. "Grandpa's here. What's got you so upset this morning?" I entered the room to find Frank carefully lifting James from his crib, his arthritic hands moving with practiced confidence despite their stiffness. Frank had raised 2 children of his own and helped with our other grandchildren during visits. He knew how to handle an infant securely despite Denise's contrary claims. James's face was red from crying, his little body tense with distress. Frank cradled him against his chest, one hand supporting his head, while the other patted his back in a gentle rhythm. "I think he might be having some gas pain," Frank suggested, shifting James slightly to a position that often helped with infant colic. "He's drawing his legs up the same way Michael used to." I moved closer, observing James's posture and the way his cries began to soften in response to Frank's gentle bouncing. "You're probably right. Let me get the gripe water from downstairs." Before I could leave, we heard the bathroom door open and quick footsteps in the hallway. Denise appeared in the nursery doorway, her hair wet from the shower, wearing a bathrobe. Her expression transformed from surprise to fury in an instant as she registered Frank holding James. "What are you doing?" she demanded, her voice sharp enough to make the baby startle and resume crying. "James was crying," Frank explained calmly. "We could hear him downstairs and came to check since it seemed you might be in the shower." Denise crossed the room in 3 quick strides, her face contorted with anger I had never seen so nakedly displayed. "Give him to me right now," she ordered, reaching for the baby. "Let me just finish calming him," Frank suggested, continuing the gentle bouncing motion that had been working before the interruption. I think he's having some gas pain. What happened next occurred so quickly that I barely had time to process it. Denise shoved Frank's shoulder hard, causing him to stumble backward. Only his instinctive tightening of his hold on James prevented a dangerous situation as Frank's balance wavered. "Don't touch him!" Denise shouted, her voice echoing in the small room. "You're filthy! Your medications make you toxic!" I lunged forward, steadying Frank with one arm while ensuring James remained secure in his grip. The baby was now screaming again, frightened by the sudden movement and loud voices. The look on Frank's face in that moment will stay with me forever. Shock giving way to profound hurt, then a quiet dignity, despite the public humiliation. His hands were trembling not from arthritis, but from the emotional impact of being treated as dangerous to his own grandson. "I'll take him," I said quietly to Frank, carefully transferring James to my arms. Frank nodded silently and backed away. His shoulders hunched as he moved toward the door. Denise wasn't finished. "I've told you both repeatedly that he shouldn't be handling James. Those arthritis medications are excreted through the skin. Do you want to poison our baby? Is that what you want?" "Denise, that's simply not true," I said firmly, my nurse's training overriding my shock. "Frank's medications pose absolutely no risk to James through normal contact. We've shown you the research." "Don't tell me what's safe for my baby," Denise continued, her voice rising further as she followed Frank toward the hallway. "This is about boundaries that you two constantly disrespect. You think because it's your house, you can just do whatever you want." I placed James in his crib for safety and followed them, concerned about Frank, who was moving slowly down the stairs, one hand gripping the railing for support. Denise continued her tirade, oblivious or indifferent to the effect her words were having. "Maybe we should have moved out years ago, away from your interfering and outdated ideas about childcare. You're too old to understand modern parenting. Your methods are dangerous and obsolete." When we reached this kitchen, I found Frank standing by the sink, his back to us, his shoulders shaking slightly. In 42 years of marriage, I had seen my husband cry only twice, when each of our children was born and when his mother died. Now silent tears tracked down his cheeks as he stared out the window at the garden he had tended for 3 decades. Something fundamental shifted inside me in that moment. The hurt, frustration, and resentment that had been building for years crystallized into absolute clarity. This was our home. Frank was my husband, and we had allowed ourselves to be diminished, disrespected, and now physically assaulted within our own walls. Denise was still ranting about boundaries and her authority as James's mother when I picked up the cordless phone from the counter. With deliberate calm, I dialed Michael's cell number, my eyes never leaving Frank's defeated posture by the window. "What are you doing?" Denise demanded, momentarily pausing her tirade. "Calling my son," I replied, my voice steadier than I would have expected given the adrenaline coursing through my body. Michael answered on the 4th ring, the background noise suggesting he was already at his office. "Mom, is everything okay? I'm just heading into a meeting." "Get home now." 3 words spoken without anger, but with an authority I hadn't exercised in years. In the background, I could hear baby James still crying upstairs, and Denise drawing breath to continue her accusations. What's happened?" Michael's voice shifted from distracted to concerned. "Your wife just shoved your father while he was holding your son. Get home now." I ended the call before he could respond, placing the phone carefully back in its cradle. Denise stared at me, her expression a mixture of shock and defiance. For perhaps the first time since she had entered our lives, she seemed temporarily speechless. "I suggest you go check on James," I said quietly. "Frank and I will be in the living room waiting for Michael." As Denise turned to go upstairs, muttering about manipulation and overreaction, I moved to Frank's side and gently touched his arm. He turned to face me, and the depth of hurt in his eyes nearly broke my resolve. "It's time, isn't it?" he asked softly. I nodded, taking his hand in mine. "Yes, Frank, It's long past time. The 32 minutes between my phone call and Michael's arrival home felt simultaneously endless and insufficient for preparing what needed to be said. Frank and I sat side by side on our living room sofa, hands clasped between us, speaking little but drawing strength from each other's presence. Upstairs, we could hear Denise moving around, her footsteps occasionally punctuated by the sound of drawers opening and closing with more force than necessary. James had stopped crying, suggesting she had attended to whatever had been causing his discomfort. "What exactly are we going to say?" Frank asked, as we waited, his voice low. "The truth," I replied simply. "No accusations, no emotional appeals, just facts and consequences." Frank nodded, squeezing my hand. "We should have done this years ago." "Yes," I acknowledged, "but we're doing it now." When Michael's car pulled into the driveway, I felt Frank tense beside me. Our son had always been more sensitive to criticism than our daughter, more eager to please others even at his own expense. The conversation ahead would not be easy for any of us. The front door opened, and Michael rushed in, his expression a mixture of concern and confusion. "What's going on? Dad, are you okay?" Before either of us could answer, Denise appeared at the bottom of the stairs, James cradled against her shoulder. "Your mother is overreacting as usual," she said dismissively. "I barely touched your father. He was holding James incorrectly." "That's not true," I stated calmly. "Frank was holding James perfectly safely, using the same techniques he used with you as a baby." Denise shoved him hard enough that he stumbled. If his reflexes had been slower, or if his arthritis had caused his hands to spasm, James could have been dropped. Michael looked between us, uncertainty evident in his expression. "Denise, did you push Dad?" "I may have been a bit forceful," she admitted reluctantly. "But I was protecting our son. Your father's medications." "Stop," I interrupted firmly. "That excuse has no medical validity, and you know it. I've provided you with multiple research papers confirming that Frank's medications pose zero risk to James through normal contact." "This isn't really about medications or holding techniques," Frank added quietly. "This is about respect, boundaries, and how we treat each other in this home." "Our home," I emphasized gently but firmly. "The home Frank and I worked for 40 years to create and maintain. The home we've generously shared with you for 9 years without asking for rent or significant contribution to expenses." Michael shifted uncomfortably. "Mom, Dad, we've always appreciated. Please let me finish, Michael." My tone remained calm but left no room for interruption. "What happened this morning isn't an isolated incident. It's the culmination of a pattern of behavior that has been building for years. Frank and I have gradually been made to feel like unwelcome guests in our own home. Our preferences, needs, and even our expertise have been systematically dismissed." "That's not fair," Denise protested, bouncing James slightly as he began to fuss. "We've made compromises too." "What compromises exactly?" Frank asked, with genuine curiosity. "Can you name specific instances where you've adjusted your preferences to accommodate ours in the past year?" Denise's silence was telling. I reached for the folder I had placed on the coffee table before Michael's arrival. "We've prepared some documents we'd like to discuss with both of you." Michael sat down in the armchair across from us, his posture tense. "What documents?" "First, financial records." I removed several papers from the folder. "Based on your combined current incomes, which we were able to verify through bank statements you've left visible and mail delivered to this address, you and Denise can comfortably afford your own housing. You have been able to afford it for at least the past 5 years." Michael's eyes widened slightly. "You looked at our financial information. When we found unopened rental applications in your bathroom drawer that Denise claimed had been submitted months ago, yes, we felt justified in verifying what we were being told." Frank's voice carried no apology. I continued. "Second, documentation of the verbal and psychological patterns that have developed in this household. I handed Michael several pages of notes detailing incident dates and specific behaviors that had contributed to our current situation. "You've been keeping a log of our behavior?" Denise asked incredulously. "Like we're children. Like we're people experiencing a form of emotional abuse in our own home," I corrected gently. "Which brings me to the third document." I removed a single sheet of paper and placed it on the coffee table between us. "This is a formal 30-day notice to vacate the premises." The silence that followed was absolute. Even James seemed to sense the gravity of the moment, his fussing subsiding to curious observation. "You're evicting us," Michael finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Your own son and grandson. We're asking you to do what you should have done years ago," Frank replied. "Establish your own independent household where you can make your own rules and live according to your own preferences." "We understand this may feel sudden," I added, though it was anything but sudden from our perspective. "But this arrangement has become untenable. Frank and I are in our 60s. These should be our golden years together, enjoying our home and each other's company without constantly walking on eggshells or being treated as incompetent or dangerous." Michael looked stricken, glancing between us and Denise, as if hoping someone would reveal this as an elaborate joke. "But where would we go on such short notice? What about James?" "You have substantial savings," I reminded him. "More than enough for a security deposit and first month's rent on an appropriate apartment. As for timing, 30 days is the legal minimum notice required in this state for tenants, which is essentially what you've become." "And if we refuse?" Denise asked, her tone challenging. Frank sighed heavily. "Then we would be forced to pursue formal eviction proceedings through the courts. We've consulted with an attorney who has advised us on our legal rights as homeowners. We don't want to take that route, Denise. It would be painful for everyone involved." "You'd sue your own son?" Her incredulity seemed genuine. "We would protect our right to peace and dignity in our own home," I clarified. "Just as you've been fiercely protecting what you perceive as your rights as parents." Michael stood abruptly, pacing to the window and back. "This is crazy. We're family. Families don't evict each other." "Families also don't treat each other with contempt and disrespect," Frank countered quietly. "They don't physically push elderly relatives. They don't create elaborate false medical concerns to maintain control. They don't systematically erase decades of history and memories from shared spaces." "What your father is saying," I translated, seeing Michael's defensive expression, "is that this decision comes after years of trying to make this arrangement work. It isn't impulsive or retaliatory for one incident. It's the necessary conclusion to a situation that has become harmful to everyone involved, including you and James." "How is having our own place better for James?" Denise demanded. "He has 2 extra caretakers here at his disposal." "That perspective is exactly the problem," I replied. "Frank and I are not at your disposal. We're individuals with our own lives' needs and boundaries. James deserves to see his grandparents in a healthy, respectful relationship with his parents, not as subordinates to be commanded and criticized." Michael returned to his seat, looking defeated. "I had no idea you felt this way. Why didn't you say something sooner?" The question almost made me laugh, despite the seriousness of the situation. "We have tried, Michael, countless times over the years. But every concern was dismissed. Every boundary negotiation ended with us conceding to Denise's preferences. Eventually, we stopped trying because the pattern was so established." "What about grandparents' rights?" Denise suddenly asked. "If we move out, you might never see James again." The naked threat hung in the air between us. I had anticipated this tactic and was prepared. "We've researched grandparents' rights as well," I said calmly. "In this state, given our established relationship with James since birth, and the fact that you've been living in our home, we would have a strong case for court-mandated visitation if you attempted to cut us off out of retaliation." Frank leaned forward slightly. But that's not what any of us want, is it? We don't want legal battles. We want a healthy family dynamic where everyone is respected. A heavy silence fell over the room as the reality of our position became clear. This wasn't a negotiation or an emotional outburst to be weathered until things returned to the status quo. This was a definitive turning point. "Can we have some time to discuss this privately?" Michael finally asked. "Of course," I agreed. "Frank and I will take a walk around the neighborhood. We'll be back in an hour." As we stood to leave, I noticed James watching us with curious eyes from Denise's arms. I gently touched his tiny hand. "We're doing this for you too, little one," I whispered. "Someday you'll understand." Outside in the fresh spring air, Frank and I walked slowly down the tree-lined street where we had lived for over 3 decades. Neither of us spoke immediately, processing the weight of what we had just done and the uncertain path ahead. "Do you think we were too harsh?" Frank finally asked as we turned the corner. I considered the question carefully. "No, firm but fair. We're not throwing them onto the street. We're asking them to do what most adults their age already do: live independently." Frank nodded, his pace measured to accommodate his arthritic knees. "It feels both terrible and right at the same time. Is that strange?" "Not at all," I replied, slipping my arm through his. "The right decision isn't always the easy one." We completed our circuit of the neighborhood in contemplative silence, drawing strength from each other's presence as we had through 4 decades of marriage. Whatever came next, we would face it together, not as background characters in someone else's story, but as the authors of our own. The hour following our confrontation stretched into a day of tense silence, then a week of careful negotiations and painful adjustments. Michael and Denise initially retreated upstairs, with James emerging only for necessities and avoiding direct conversation. Frank and I maintained our normal routines, providing space for them to process while standing firm in our decision. On the 3rd evening, Michael came downstairs alone after Denise and James had gone to bed. I was reading in my favorite chair while Frank completed a crossword puzzle, the quiet domesticity we had been gradually reclaiming since establishing our boundary. "Can we talk?" Michael asked hesitantly, hovering in the doorway. "Of course," Frank replied, setting aside his puzzle. "Join us." Michael sat on the edge of the sofa, hands clasped between his knees in a posture that reminded me painfully of his childhood self preparing to confess a misdeed. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about how things have been these past few years." I marked my place in my book and gave him my full attention. "We're listening." "I didn't see it," he admitted, his voice catching slightly. "Or maybe I didn't want to see it. How Denise was treating you both. How I was allowing it by staying silent." "It happened gradually," Frank offered kindly. "That's often how these situations develop. Not in dramatic leaps, but in small steps that seem individually reasonable until you look back and realize how far you've traveled from where you started." Michael nodded, staring at his hands. "I remember when we first moved in. It was supposed to be temporary, just until I found another job. Then it became about saving for a down payment, then about waiting for the housing market to improve." He looked up, meeting my eyes directly. "But the truth is, it was convenient, and Denise liked having control over our living situation." The honest admission surprised me. "And what about you, Michael? What did you want?" He considered the question carefully. "At first, I was grateful for your help. Then I got comfortable with the arrangement. It was financially beneficial, and it meant I could avoid confrontations with Denise about household decisions." His shoulders slumped slightly. "I took the path of least resistance even when I could see it was unfair to you both." "Marriage is complicated," Frank acknowledged. "Finding the balance between supporting your spouse and standing up for what's right isn't always straightforward." "But I should have drawn a line when she started disrespecting you," Michael insisted. "Especially after what happened with Dad. There's no excuse for that." No, there isn't, I agreed gently. Just as there's no medical justification for preventing Frank from holding his grandson. Those were control tactics, Michael, not legitimate concerns. He winced visibly at my directness, but didn't disagree. I know. I've been doing some research myself since our talk. About the medications and contact transfer. You were right all along. It was never really about the medications, Frank observed. That was just the justification for keeping me at a distance. Michael was quiet for a moment. Our marriage hasn't been great for a while now, he finally confessed. Denise has become increasingly controlling with me, too. Every decision from what I wear to how I spend my free time has to meet her approval. I've been working late, partly to avoid coming home. This admission crystallized concerns I'd had for years, but had hesitated to voice directly. That sounds like a difficult way to live, I said, carefully avoiding any hint of "I told you so." It is, Michael agreed. And now, with James, I'm worried about what kind of environment we're creating for him. I don't want him growing up thinking it's normal for one parent to dominate everyone else. Frank leaned forward slightly. What are you thinking of doing, son? We found an apartment, Michael replied. About 15 minutes from here. I signed the lease today. We can move in next week. He paused, then added, I did it without consulting Denise first. She's furious. I raised my eyebrows, surprised by this unprecedented assertion of independence. That must have been difficult. It was terrifying, he admitted with a weak smile. But also liberating. I've spent so many years avoiding conflict by giving in that I'd forgotten what it feels like to make a decision based on what I think is right. How is Denise handling it? Frank asked. Michael sighed. About as well as you'd expect. She's cycling between anger tears and attempts to negotiate exceptions. She wanted me to ask if we could stay until the end of the summer, or if you'd consider letting us convert the garage into a separate living space. And what did you tell her? I asked, keeping my tone neutral despite my internal reaction to these suggestions. I told her that the lease is signed non-refundable and we'll be moving next week as planned. His voice gained confidence as he continued. I also told her that she needs to apologize to Dad for what happened. Genuinely apologize, not the "I'm sorry you felt that way" kind she usually offers. Frank shifted in his chair, clearly uncomfortable with being the center of this negotiation. That's between Denise and me. You don't need to manage that relationship. With all due respect, Dad, I do, Michael countered with unexpected firmness. Because I enabled it. I stood by while she disrespected you in your own home. That's on me as much as it's on her. The three of us talked for another hour, carefully navigating years of unspoken tensions and unresolved conflicts. Michael revealed more details about his struggling marriage, his own dissatisfaction with the person he had become, and his fears about raising James in a household dominated by Denise's controlling behavior. I think I need counseling, he admitted near the end of our conversation. Both marriage counseling with Denise and individual therapy for myself. I've lost touch with who I am, apart from what others expect me to be. That's a brave realization, I told him, genuinely proud of his self-awareness despite the painful circumstances. Would you? He hesitated suddenly, looking very young and uncertain. Would you still want to be part of James's life, even after everything that's happened? Of course we would, Frank replied without hesitation. He's our grandson. Nothing changes that. We may need to establish clearer boundaries around visits and grandparenting, I added carefully. But our love for James is unconditional, just as our love for you has always been. When Michael finally returned upstairs, Frank and I sat in thoughtful silence, processing this unexpected development. The confrontation had catalyzed not just a change in living arrangements, but potentially a fundamental shift in our son's marriage and sense of self. Do you think they'll make it? Frank asked quietly. Their marriage? I don't know, I answered honestly. That depends on whether Denise is willing to examine her behavior and make real changes, and whether Michael can maintain his newfound backbone when things get difficult. Either way, Frank observed, it seems our grandson will have at least one parent who's beginning to understand the importance of healthy boundaries and mutual respect. That's a start, I agreed. Sometimes that's all we can hope for. A starting point for something better. The week that followed brought rapid changes to our household. Michael took time off work to apartment hunt sign necessary paperwork and begin packing their belongings. Denise alternated between cold silence and tearful accusations, particularly when I declined her suggestion that we compromise by allowing them to stay through the summer. This isn't a negotiation, I explained calmly. The decision has been made. The apartment is secured. Now we need to focus on making the transition as smooth as possible for everyone, especially James. Denise's parents surprisingly became unexpected allies in this process. When she called them expecting support against our cruelty, they instead validated our position. To be honest, Carmen, Denise's mother confided during an awkward joint packing session, we've been concerned about this living arrangement for years. It wasn't healthy for anyone involved. Denise has always had strong opinions, but living here without financial responsibilities has magnified her sense of entitlement. This admission from her own mother seemed to impact Denise more profoundly than anything Frank or I had said. The following day, she approached Frank in the garden, James in her arms. "I owe you an apology," she began stiffly. "My behavior was inappropriate. I should never have pushed you, especially while you were holding James." Though clearly rehearsed, the words appeared to cost her considerable effort. Frank accepted with grace, even as we both recognized this as a small first step, rather than a complete resolution. The day of their actual move was emotionally complex. As the last boxes were loaded into the moving truck Michael had rented, I found myself experiencing contradictory feelings: relief that our home would be ours again, anxiety about how this change would affect our relationship with James, and a wistful sadness marking the end of having our son under our roof, however problematic that arrangement had become. "You can visit whenever you want," Michael assured us as he prepared to leave. "And we'll bring James over regularly. This isn't goodbye." "We know," Frank replied, one arm around my shoulders. "It's just a new chapter for all of us." As they drove away, Frank and I stood in the driveway watching until the truck turned the corner and disappeared from view. The house behind us felt suddenly expansively empty, not with the hollow emptiness of loss, but with the open potential of reclaimed space. "What should we do first?" Frank asked, as we returned inside, the absence of baby equipment, scattered toys, and Denise's decorative touches immediately noticeable. I considered the question, running my hand along the banister that led upstairs to rooms that were now ours alone again. "Whatever we want," I replied. "That's rather the point, isn't it?" That evening, we ate dinner at our actual dining room table for the first time in months, the converted nursery now emptied of the crib and changing table that had replaced our furniture. We spoke in normal voices without monitoring our volume. Frank played his classical music without headphones. Small freedoms that felt momentous after years of constraint. Later, as we prepared for bed, Frank paused by the window overlooking the backyard. "Do you think we did the right thing?" he asked, voicing the question that had lingered beneath the surface all day. I joined him, wrapping my arms around his waist and resting my head against his shoulder. "Yes," I said with certainty. "For them, as much as for us. Some lessons can only be learned through independence and responsibility." "I'll miss having James here every day," he admitted. "So will I agreed. "But we'll build a different relationship with him now, one based on quality time rather than proximity. And without the tension that was growing in this house, those visits will be happier for everyone." As we settled into bed that night, the house around us quieter than it had been in years, I realized something important. In standing firm on our boundaries, Frank and I hadn't just reclaimed our physical space. We had reasserted our value as individuals deserving of respect and consideration. That lesson was perhaps the most important legacy we could leave for our grandson, even more than the hours of childcare or material provisions we had offered. Sometimes love means saying no. Sometimes the most generous gift you can give your adult children is the expectation that they function as adults. These weren't easy realizations, but as I drifted toward sleep beside my husband of 42 years, I felt a profound peace with the difficult stand we had taken. 6 months have passed since Michael, Denise, and James moved into their own apartment. The transition period was challenging with adjustments required on all sides as we established new patterns of interaction and visitation. Many days were difficult, some painfully so. But gradually, a healthier family dynamic has emerged from the necessary separation. Frank and I spent the first month reclaiming our home room by room. We moved his desk back to the upstairs office where he could work on the memoir he'd been postponing for years. We restored the dining room to its original purpose, bringing my grandmother's china cabinet down from the attic and polishing the neglected silver. We repainted walls, rearranged furniture, and rehung family photographs that had been deemed cluttered under Denise's aesthetic reign. Most significantly, we reclaimed our daily routines and social connections. Frank rejoined his weekly chess group at the community center, an activity he had abandoned when the Tuesday evening meetings conflicted with Denise's preferred dinner schedule. I returned to my book club and volunteer work at the hospital auxiliary. Together, we resumed attending church services and reconnected with friends we had gradually lost touch with during the years of increasing isolation. Frank's health improved notably within weeks. His blood pressure readings stabilized without medication adjustments. His arthritis pain, while still present, became more manageable as the constant stress of walking on eggshells diminished. The subtle stoop that had developed in his posture straightened, and the spark returned to his eyes as he engaged with life without constant criticism. Our relationship with Michael evolved in unexpected ways. Freed from the daily tensions of our shared housing situation, we found a new foundation for adult parent-child interactions. He began calling regularly, not out of obligation, but with genuine interest in our activities and perspectives. During visits with James, he actively encouraged Frank's involvement, explicitly contradicting the harmful narratives Denise had created about safety concerns. "Dad, would you mind watching James while I help Mom with lunch?" he asked during their second visit, deliberately handing the baby to Frank without hesitation or hovering supervision. These small gestures of trust and respect helped heal wounds that had developed over years of erosion. Michael also began seeking Frank's advice about parenting and life decisions, listening with new appreciation for the wisdom his father had gained through decades of teaching and raising children. Our relationship with Denise remains more complex and is still evolving. The forced independence initially heightened her resentment, and she made several attempts to re-establish control through manipulating access to James. When she abruptly canceled 2 scheduled visits citing vague scheduling conflicts, Michael surprised us by arriving alone with the baby. "Denise isn't feeling well," he explained diplomatically, though his expression conveyed a different story. "But James and I didn't want to miss seeing you." This marked a significant shift, Michael making independent decisions about his son's relationship with his grandparents rather than automatically deferring to Denise's preferences. It also signaled to Denise that alienating us from James would not be as simple as she might have hoped. Gradually, as the reality of their new situation settled in, Denise's approach began to change. The practical challenges of maintaining her own household without my constant assistance required adaptations. Michael's newfound assertiveness meant her controlling behaviors met with more resistance. Most importantly, her parents continued to support our position rather than enabling her sense of grievance. "They need to learn to function as an independent family unit," her father stated firmly during a tense phone call I overheard. Carmen and Frank did you a favor by hosting you for 9 years. The appropriate response is gratitude, not retaliation. By the 3rd month, Denise began accompanying Michael and James on visits again, her manner still somewhat stiff, but noticeably more civil. She made small concessions, allowing Frank to hold James without supervision, acknowledging when I complimented her handling of a challenging nap time, accepting offers of advice without immediate rejection. The most significant breakthrough came unexpectedly during a Sunday dinner in their 4th month of independence. James had begun crawling a milestone we were celebrating together. As he scooted across their living room floor toward an electrical outlet, both Denise and I moved simultaneously to redirect him. "He's so fast, suddenly," she commented, scooping him up before he reached his destination. "They all are at this stage," I agreed. Michael was the same way. 0 to lightning speed overnight. Instead of dismissing my experience as outdated, Denise hesitated, then asked, "What did you do to baby-proof? We've covered the outlets, but he finds new hazards every day." This simple question, genuine non-defensive acknowledging my relevant experience, opened a door to the kind of grandmother-mother relationship I had always hoped for. We spent 20 minutes discussing practical baby-proofing strategies, sharing concerns and solutions as allies rather than adversaries in James's care. These moments remain intermittent rather than constant. Denise still struggles with control issues and occasionally reverts to her previous patterns when stressed. The difference now is that such behaviors no longer dominate our interactions or go unchallenged by Michael. Perhaps the most profound change has occurred in Michael himself. The initial steps toward independence that began with our confrontation have developed into significant personal growth. 2 months after moving out, he began individual therapy sessions to address patterns of conflict avoidance and identity suppression that had characterized his adult relationships. "I realized I don't even know what I want most of the time," he confided during a private lunch. "I've spent so many years going along with what other people expect that I've lost touch with my own preferences and boundaries." He and Denise also started marriage counseling, though, with mixed results so far. The process has been challenging, with moments of progress interspersed with setbacks and resistance, particularly from Denise. Whether their marriage will ultimately strengthen or dissolve remains uncertain, but Michael's commitment to his own emotional health and his role as James's father has become unwavering. "Whatever happens between Denise and me," he assured us during a difficult period when their conflicts intensified, "I will make sure James has a strong relationship with both of you. That's non-negotiable." Our relationship with our daughter Emma and her family has also flourished with the restoration of balance in our household. Previously, Emma had reduced her visits due to the constant tension and Denise's subtle competitiveness regarding the children. Now Emma and her family come regularly, their children playing with James during overlapping visits that would have been logistically and emotionally impossible in our previous arrangement. "It's like having my parents back," Emma commented recently as we sat in the garden watching Frank teach her 9-year-old son how to identify butterfly species. "For years, I felt like I was visiting strangers who happened to look like Mom and Dad." Today marks exactly 6 months since Michael, Denise, and James moved into their own place. We're celebrating with a family dinner at our home, not just Michael's family, but Emma's as well, bringing all our grandchildren together. Frank spent the morning preparing his famous grilled salmon, while I baked 2 pies using berries from our garden. As I set the dining room table with my grandmother's china, no longer hidden away but proudly displayed and used, I reflect on the painful but necessary journey we've undergone as a family. The 3 words I spoke to Michael that day, "Get home now," represented more than an immediate summons. They marked a turning point, a reclamation of voice and agency that had gradually been surrendered over years of misplaced accommodation. Frank joins me in the dining room, slipping an arm around my waist as we survey the prepared table. "It looks beautiful," he says, kissing my temple. "Just like the hostess." "Flatterer?" I reply, leaning into his embrace. "Truth-teller," he corrects with a smile. "Have I mentioned lately how proud I am of you?" Standing up for us the way you did wasn't easy. It wasn't just for us, I remind him. It was for Michael too, and for James. Some lessons can only be learned through appropriate boundaries. The doorbell rings, signaling our family's arrival. As we move to welcome them, I'm struck by the contrast between today's anticipation and the anxious dread that often preceded family gatherings in our previous dynamic. There will still be challenging moments ahead, adjustments to navigate, and old patterns to resist. But the foundation has shifted from obligation and control to choice and respect. Sometimes, the most loving thing we can say to family is simply enough, not as punishment, but as the beginning of healing for everyone involved. In our case, those 3 words, "Get home now," followed by 30 days' notice, became the catalyst for transformations none of us could have fully anticipated. As I open our front door to greet our grandchildren's excited faces, I'm grateful for the difficult stand we took to reclaim our home and our dignity. Family relationships flourish best, not through unlimited tolerance of mistreatment, but through the healthy balance of love and respect that makes a house truly a home for everyone who enters it. Have you ever had to set difficult boundaries with loved ones living in your home? How did you handle the conversation, and what was the outcome? Share your experiences in the comments below. Remember that standing up for yourself isn't selfish. It's often necessary for truly healthy relationships. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe to hear more authentic family stories. And if you know someone struggling with similar household tensions, sharing this video might give them the courage to address their own situation. Thank you for listening to my journey, and remember, love without respect isn't truly love at all.